So I'm back talking with Jerry Meral, and we're going to shift now to the whole question of the Stanislaus and how Jerry's involvement got into that with Friends of the River and the effort to try to protect the river from being dammed. So you first voted the Stanislaus in '67, and with the Sierra Club River Terrain section. How did it go from there to becoming much more attached and involved in it?
Well, it was everyone knew about the New Melones Dam. I don't remember. I think in '67 it may have already been under construction.
Yeah, '66 is when it started construction.
So just barely. And so we all knew about this thing, and I didn't know much about water, so I got very involved with the Sierra Club Northern California Regional Conservation Committee, which had a water subcommittee, or committee really, that was chaired by a guy named Ed Royce, and then by Jake Miller, a number of very knowledgeable people. But the main educator of that committee was a guy named Ken Turner, who was very active in the Sierra Club, happened to work for the Department of Water Resources. And so he and others...
And you were studying for your PhD in biology.
Right, yeah, I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley. And so I joined this committee, I can't remember what year, but fairly early on. And we began to learn about what the deal was with the Bureau of Reclamation, their plans for rivers throughout the state. That was an era of very active dam building. A lot was going on. And so we had to learn about why this was happening. What it turned out was that one of the goals of the Sierra Club was to protect the Delta by keeping water quality good in the Delta. And Ed Royce, who was not into river conservation, felt that the New Melones, Auburn, and Marysville dams, which were three big Bureau of Reclamation dams being planned, would help keep the Delta pure. And so the Sierra Club in the early days was not opposed to any of those dams. In fact, the Water Committee thought, they might come in handy, even though they were connected to the East Side Division, which was going to export all the water down to the Central Valley, Lower Central Valley. So we met, I'm pretty sure every month in Oakland, and kind of educated ourselves, and gradually kind of had the big picture come into view of what's going on around the state. They were going to dam up the Eel, the Trinity, the Klamath, and all that. And it was the beginning of the effort to save those North Coast rivers as well. So gradually it seemed like there were flaws in the New Melones Dam plan, that it was primarily driven by flood control interests in the lower Stanislaus River, John Hurdle, others, and also by this larger plan to export the water from northern to southern California. So eventually I and Scott Fleming and others worked up a report on the Stanislaus River, and Scott Fleming was a very senior executive at Kaiser Health. In fact, like in the top tier, and he actually invented the Kaiser Health Plan with Edgar Kaiser in Hawaii. And so he had a secretary, and that was very helpful because she would type up our reports and put them in a nice condition and so on and so forth. I don't know if Kaiser knew about that, but we published a nice report on why the Stanislaus wasn't a good idea, and offered an alternative, which was raising Tulloch Reservoir, because it could have had just about as much water but would not have inundated the river. So that was pretty instrumental in the gradual progression of trying to have, because you have to have an alternative. If you get a dam under construction, you better have an alternative. The problem wasn't on the radar screen for the Bureau of Reclamation. They'd never even considered it. So in '71, I joined the Environmental Defense Fund, and we did the lawsuit that was against the Stanislaus, against the New Melones Dam. But there were also political efforts going on. We did a petition drive in '72 to try to convince the federal government not to dam up the Stanislaus. We gathered 100,000 signatures statewide. So the petition drive didn't convince Nixon. I think it convinced McGovern, but he didn't seem to win that election, so it didn't convince Nixon. So we said, well, how about going on the state level? And that's when the Prop 17 concept got going. But it was crucial to have the involvement of the raft companies and the kayaking and rafting community to some extent. Kayakers are a little quirky and individual, and some really dove in and really worked on it, and others were like, I just want to go boating. So, that's the way it is.
So when did you come across David Kay, who worked for ARDA?
I can't remember what year, but quite early on. Probably in the late 60s, I'm going to guess. And of course,
Do you have any idea of how you guys first met? It was just
I really
the
can't
river
remember.
world, and you kind
But
of.
you know, we all knew the raft operators because when we went kayaking, we would see all these raft companies there. So they're the ones who were operating in those days, anyway. I can't remember, but I do remember going down. I remember going down to meet him at ARDA headquarters and talking to him, but I can't remember exactly when that was.
Yeah. So, in terms of the effort, there was lots of effort to try to understand the dam and look at alternatives. When did the idea of creating a grassroots organization kind of come into focus?
Well, I can give you the exact moment for that. We'd finished the Stanislaus petition campaign to the president or to the federal government, and unsuccessful, but it showed 100,000 signatures is a lot. And it said, like, wow, people are really willing to work on this. And so I do remember I don't remember exactly when, let me think, it'd be 70. Probably, I'm going to guess a little bit, mid 73, something like that. My wife and I, Barbara, went up to the skunk train. We were going on a little trip on the skunk train. And I remember I'm sort of prone to something called cluster headaches, and I got one on the train. And I'm like, oh my God, this is terrible. Why am I getting a headache right in the middle of this? And I'm sort of lying back, leaning on her and going, you know, we could do an initiative. Why? Who knows? Anyway,
The neurons just broke loose at that
well,
point.
you know, the Coastal Initiative had just been done in '72,
Yeah.
and I worked on that a little bit. And while we were doing our petition campaign, I went, wow, that was very successful. So that was a stimulus. The Coastal Initiative, you know, there weren't many, actually, any environmental initiatives before that one that I can remember. And so it was like a moment, you know, Peter Douglas and all those people, like, wow, you can actually accomplish this. So I was working for EDF, which meant that we couldn't officially work on it because EDF, as a 501c3, didn't really at that time get involved in these ballot measure kind of campaigns. So it was all kind of off the books. But anyway, that was 73. We met with the raft companies, said, would you guys back this? I loaned the campaign a little of my own money to get it started. And then the raft companies got very involved. Volunteers just came out of the woodwork. We did have a signature coordinator, a guy named Dennis Vieira, who was great at organizing volunteers.
So let's pull back from Prop 17 for a second because I want to cover that more specifically. But the 100,000 signature campaign, where did that idea even come from?
Oh, I just thought it up because I thought we should do something. Partly, though, it came out of the successful 100,000 signatures that I was working on to save Point Reyes National Seashore. We gathered 100,000 signatures under the leadership of Peter Bear, who became the Wild River guru too, and even had a march down Van Ness Avenue in San Francisco. So that was very successful and went to Nixon. And so it was like, oh, Nixon will respond to these petitions. And so that was part of it.
It's interesting how everything has a four-story that leads to it. It's almost nothing except the idea of an initiative comes out of thin air.
Well, even the initiative, well, not exactly.
Well,
but,
the coastal measure clearly
but
was.
the initiative in California, was started in 1911 by Hiram Johnson, came out of an idea in Australia. And I'm sure it had some predecessor there too. So these things always have a thread.
Yeah. So you and David Kay are known to have created the Friends of the River as an organization. Is that?
Yeah, we had to have an organization, but the key thing was we needed campaign managers outside, and so we used that as both organizing volunteers and also the official voice of the campaign.
Setting up for Proposition 17.
Right. Yeah.
And were there any other sort of strategies or thoughts outside of where the signatures and the initiative led to that were important to understand?
Yeah, David and I thought, well, what we should do is convince, we saw Governor Reagan canceled the Dos Rios Dam in 72 or 71, whatever it was. And so we said, let's convince him to cancel New Maloney's too. And so we went to meet, David and I, I look back at it as a little bit of naivete on our parts, but we went to meet with Ike Livermore, who was the most wonderful guy.
Who was the Resources Secretary?
He was the Resources Secretary under Ronald Reagan, and a super conservationist. I mean, just save the redwoods, save Mineral King. I mean, he just accomplished so much. So we met with Ike, and he said, well, you want me to oppose New Maloney's Dam, but I need some support from local government. You got to get me someone local down there. So we went and made an appearance before the Calaveras County Water District, because this
You and David Kay.
Yeah, David and I, because it was going to affect, we felt, their ability to extract water from the Stanislaus, which it was, and they were not friendly to New Maloney's Dam. And so we just about got them to pass a resolution, but then they sort of got wishy-washy, and my guess is their local congressman, John McFall, leaned on them and said, don't you dare, because he was very pro-dam.
Yeah.
And so, you know, we couldn't quite pull that off. But it was a political education experience. So there were a number of efforts like that to kind of destabilize Auburn Dam. New Maloney's Dam.
So this is you sort of
Dam.
going extra effort outside of normal work process.
Well, no, because the Environmental Defense Fund did bring a lawsuit against the dam.
And this could fall underneath that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, those kind of political efforts would count. Only the initiative itself could not be an official EDF. Now, today, laws changed, and it could be. But
yeah, it's a legislative, it's not a lobbying process. Any recollections of David? He passed away a few years back.
Yeah, it's been quite a few years now, even his son.
Yeah, his son, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, you know, David is, Lou Elliott was the head of the company, ARDA. And Lou, there's various stories about Lou and Bryce going down various huge Canadian rivers and Lou having a swim that may have affected his later mental capacity. Who knows what happened there? It might have been the Fraser. Anyway, so Lou was, you know, great, but a little off the wall. Whereas David was like calm, cool, collected, strategic, you know, worked on fundraising with the outfitters and just, you know, indispensable partner, just great.
And David's role is really, I think, unique among the outfitters because he was essentially the marketing director for ARDA, which had set up as a nonprofit. It contracted with Elliott River Tours, which was the private company that Lou owned. Yeah. So it was really just a booking agent and an educational operation. Yeah. And David clearly had lots of influence on the messaging that ARDA put out, which was very strongly wrapped in conservation and values, and serious, you know, real values about why protect nature.
Right.
But he was the only person in the outfitter world who was professionally also engaged directly in this political activity. Everybody else was kind of just
but they contributed in every possible way. I mean, publicity trips, endless publicity trips, organizing guides to do stuff. All the outfitters, just about all, I can't remember everyone, but Vladimir and, you know, George and all these guys.
Were the outfitters organized in any way to do that?
You know, they probably were internally the way the Tuolumne outfitters are now, but I was not really part of that. I worked with them individually pretty much. Yeah. But they would come to meetings and stuff like that. Of course, it was their livelihoods, at least those who were making any money on it. So they were engaged, but they were pretty passionate about it.
Yeah, it seems like without that outfitter wing of the process, that it just, everything else would have been a real slow motion.
I don't know if you went back.
I say that because of the volume of people eventually going down the river and the guides' involvement and all of that.
It would have been interesting to see whether all of this activity would have happened had there been no commercial rafting on the river. Then you would have had to rely totally on just general conservationists, river users, and so on. It would have been a lot harder. I can't say it would be impossible, but it would be a lot harder.
How many times have you run the Stanislaus?
I don't know. I could look it up, but a lot.
A lot.
Yeah. I mean, I did not run it after... I don't think I've been on it since 1976 or something like that. Just, you know, too weird.
Yeah.
But I ran it, you know, several times a year before that, so a lot.
Any impressions of the river that just stick with you?
Well, the river, Stanislaus was sort of unique because of its limestone character. There's been not a lot of limestone in California in general, Sierra Valley, I guess. But, so it has a different aspect. You know, the cliffs are different, the rocks are different. You have the caves that are pretty unique. I mean, not many other rivers that I know of have caves right off the river. Probably affected the vegetation. I wasn't that aware of that much, but I'm sure it did. And so it was sort of unique in that way, you know. I mean, we have a lot of gorgeous rivers in California, but the Stanislaus is different. There are some rivers like the Stanislaus Cache Creek, which has this weird and amazing geology that are just, they stand out from everything else because just geologically they're different.
Yeah.
You can see a lot of that in Tim Palmer's photographs.
Oh, yeah.